Well, that was the opening that God placed there, reading that book, and that's what needed to happen. It was very painful to recognize the reality of what was wrong with me.
Today on In Your Corner, founder of Veterans Restoration Ministries, David Litteral talks about challenges veterans face and how they can overcome them.
Welcome to In Your Corner. Today you're in for a special treat. We're joined by my good friend David Litteral, a former Vietnam veteran who also has Veterans Restoration Ministries. Wait till you hear his amazing story today on In Your Corner. We're joined on the program today by a longtime friend and a former Vietnam veteran. David Litteral's with us today, and I have a lot of admiration and respect for David because he put his life on the line for his country in Vietnam. And that war really had an adverse effect on his life, but today he's made some positive changes. However, he did suffer from post-traumatic stress for something like 26 years. And David's here to share his story. David, welcome today.
Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about, your life and your life in the war in Vietnam.
Well, Kerry, when I was 19 years old, just like a lot of young men in that era, I received a letter in the mail one day that said, "Congratulations, you've been invited to serve in the United States military." And I found myself a few short months after that inducted into the United States military in a short period of time after training, flying into South Vietnam. And a lot of the times most of the time when we went to Vietnam as soldiers, we went individually. In other words, we didn't know the guys that was flying into Vietnam with each other because we didn't go as units by and large. Where that's different from most other wars that's taken place before Vietnam or after Vietnam. And I was on a plane with a couple of hundred, maybe 300 young guys, but I didn't know but one or two of them, and I felt all alone. And flying in at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the captain came on the speaker and said, "We have just crossed into the Republic of South Vietnam's airspace. Welcome to Vietnam. Welcome to the war." And my heart was filled with terror, to be honest with you.
Sure.
I was not planning on being a hero. I didn't want to be there, but I found myself thrown in the middle of a war. And it was probably the most evil place on the planet of the earth at that time. That's my opinion. And it certainly had that kind of effect on me. When I stepped off of the plane, I felt the evilness of Vietnam. Being terrified as a young kid, 20-year-old kid that had never been away from home. And fully expecting to die because I'd been trained and told the entire time we were being trained, "You're going to Vietnam and you're going to die. You're not coming back home." Seeing friends that I'd grown up and gone to high school with come back home in body bags, and we'd get out of class from school to go to the funerals. Other friends come back missing body parts. And they're seeing the same thing today, by the way. Yeah. The only difference is today is that there's not a draft. It's an all-volunteer army, and that we thank God for that. But back at that time, 30 to 40% of the soldiers that went to Vietnam were draftees, or they were in the service because they were not wanting to be drafted. Yeah. But anyway, I found myself in the middle of Vietnam, and it was a crazy, crazy war.
Well, you were there and had some things happen to you, and I know that place almost destroyed you mentally. Right. But you almost there was a circumstance there where you felt like you almost died.
There's a lot of things that I haven't been able to remember that took place in Vietnam. I've talked to some of the guys that I was with. I did things that my MOS didn't call for. For example, I was a stock control and accounting specialist, and I wasn't supposed to be in a combat situation, according to my understanding anyway. But I ended up riding shotgun on what they call the Red Ball Express, and that was perfectly fine with me because that got me out of the spit, shine, and polish part of the
military
war. Yeah. And so I stayed on the driver's side riding shotgun, and the driver and myself were the only two guys that were together. We weren't in convoys. It was a high priority requisition that we had to get out to wherever they needed it. And so consequently, we were all alone by ourselves. And I talked to that guy, who was my best friend, by the way, in Vietnam. And I hadn't talked to him for probably 25, 26 years because I'd wiped that all out of my mind and didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I found him and called him one day after God was been dealing with my heart sometime. And I asked him to forgive me for not keeping in communication with him and cutting off communication with him when we got out of Vietnam. And he understood, but he began to tell me things that happened to us. And one of the things he said that shocked me, he said, David, he said, we should have been killed, you and I, 100 times. And I said, what are you talking about? And he began to relate different episodes that had happened. And I was shocked because I didn't recall things that were life and death situations. One time, but I had a mother and father, that's the thing I want to tell you about, that were godly people and were prayer warriors. And they were interceding on my behalf and many other men that were in Vietnam, or boys that were in Vietnam at the time. And for some reason, I got tangled up in a perimeter one night. And all I can remember, and this is the way that I remember it, I was tangled up in the barbed wire, the Constantine wire, which is nearly impossible to get out of. And my back was bleeding, my arms were bleeding, and there was two men that was trying to untangle the wire. And I remember flares going off and noise all around and confusion all around. But I finally got out of it. They brought me back into inside of the compound, and I forgot about it. 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail, and it was from my mother, and she began to ask me questions. She said, I don't know if this was you or not. She said, but I was awakened in the middle of the night by the Spirit of the Lord, and I saw a young man, and I could only see his back, and it was cut up and bruised by some kind of wire that was cutting into him. There were two men, a Mexican and an Indian, on both sides of him, and they drew him out of the mess that he was in to save his life. And she said, I began to pray. And she said, just tell me if it was you. And I showed that letter to those two guys, and they said, man, your mother must have ESP, because she described the event down to a T, where I didn't even know, but those two guys knew. And God spared my life.
Wow.
Because my mother and father called on the name of the Lord.
Isn't that amazing? That's an amazing story. Friends, we'll be back in just a moment, and David's going to tell you more about his story and his work today, how he's helping other veterans. So stay tuned to In Your Corner.